The nights in Los Angeles had a strange stillness lately, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Beneath the glass towers and ocean winds, the Spencer family seemed to live inside a world of their own, one built on ambition, loyalty, and the quiet terror of losing control. It had been months since Liam's diagnosis had shaken that foundation. The discovery of his inoperable brain tumor had cast a shadow across them all, leaving behind scars no doctor could heal. Though Liam had stabilized, the memory of his suffering lingered like a ghost at every family gathering, a reminder that even the powerful were not immune to the cruelty of fate. Yet what none of them knew was that history had begun to echo itself. This time, it was Will, the youngest Spencer, the one who was supposed to be untouchable, who had started to feel something slipping inside him, something he could neither name nor escape. At first, it was nothing more than a dull ache behind his eyes. He blamed the long hours, the caffeine, the restless nights at the office. But as the weeks passed, the pain became sharper, stranger, as if something within his head was quietly trying to break free. There were moments when sound distorted, when light fractured into color, when he would lose his balance for just a second and pretend it hadn't happened. Will told himself he was imagining it, that the fear of becoming another Liam was making him paranoid. He'd spent his whole life living in his brother's shadow, and he refused to be another chapter in his father's tragedy. So he hid it. He buried every symptom behind a practiced smile, behind the charming arrogance that Bill had once called the Spencer armor. But beneath that armor, the panic grew like a whisper that wouldn't stop. Will's relationship with Electra had been the one part of his life untouched by family tension. She wasn't part of the business, the endless power struggles, or the legacy that weighed on him. She was sunlight where the rest of his world was steel. But lately, even with her, he found himself drifting, distant, unable to focus on her laughter or her touch. She noticed. Electra was the kind of woman who sensed things before they were spoken, who could read truth in the smallest tremor of someone's hand. And one evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the coast, she saw it. The moment his composure cracked. Will had gone pale, his hand pressed to his temple, his breath unsteady. When she reached for him, he brushed her off, insisting it was nothing. But in his eyes she saw the unmistakable shadow of fear, and it terrified her. That night, after he fell asleep, she sat in the dark beside him, the glow of her phone screen illuminating her trembling hands as she searched for every article, every symptom, every possibility. The words brain tumor flashed again, and with each new line of text her heart broke a little more. She remembered Liam's illness, how Bill had tried to keep control, how Katie had fallen apart. She couldn't bear the thought of that repeating, of Will becoming another victim of whatever curse seemed to haunt this family. Yet she also couldn't betray his trust. If she told Bill or Katie without proof, she would be crossing a line she might never recover from. But if she stayed silent and Will's condition worsened, she would never forgive herself. It was a choice between love and loyalty, between silence and saving him. In the days that followed, Electra tried to keep her fear hidden, but her worry manifested in subtle ways. Her distracted gaze, her hands shaking when she poured coffee, her sudden bursts of protectiveness. Will noticed and became irritated. He hated pity. He hated being watched. He told her to stop hovering, to trust him, but the more he pushed her away, the more desperate she became. Every time he stumbled, every time he forgot something mid-sentence, her anxiety grew. Eventually, she couldn't bear it anymore. One afternoon, while Will was in a meeting, she called Dr. Harding, the neurologist who had treated Liam, and asked for advice without giving a name. Harding's tone shifted instantly, recognizing the fear behind her questions. "If the symptoms sound familiar," he said softly, "don't wait. Early scans can make all the difference." That night, Electra confronted Will.
She didn't mean to.
It wasn't planned. It just spilled out between them. She told him what she'd seen, the lapses, the pain, the way his eyes sometimes went unfocused. Will exploded. The words came out sharp, cutting, driven by a fear he refused to name. He accused her of treating him like a patient, not a partner, of invading his privacy, of trying to drag him into the same spiral that had consumed his brother. His voice rose, then cracked, and for a moment, he looked more terrified than angry. She wanted to hold him, but he stepped back, his breathing ragged. "I'm fine," he said. "I'm not Liam. I'm not dying." Then he walked out, leaving Electra alone with the hollow sound of the door closing. When Will returned home hours later, the house was dark. He stood in front of the mirror, staring at himself as though the reflection might offer answers. The ache in his head pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat behind his skull. He thought about calling Liam, but what could he say? That he was afraid of becoming him? That every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the same fragility beneath the same confident surface? He couldn't burden his brother again, not after everything Liam had already endured. So he swallowed the pain, took a deep breath, and swore to himself he would face it alone. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in families built on power and pride. The next morning, Bill Spencer noticed his son's pale complexion, the slight tremor in his hands. Bill had always been a man who could read weakness like scent in the air. When he asked if something was wrong, Will laughed it off, saying he'd been working too much. Yet Bill's instincts told him otherwise. After Liam's illness, Bill had promised himself that he would never again ignore the signs of danger in his family, never again allow pride to blind him. And so, without Will's knowledge, he reached out to Electra. The conversation was brutal. She tried to deny it at first, to protect Will, but Bill's questions were relentless. When he finally said, "If my son is sick, you'll never forgive yourself for hiding it," she broke. Tears filled her eyes as she confessed what she knew, or rather, what she feared. Bill listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he thanked her quietly and left without another word. That night, Bill drove alone through the city, the same streets where he had once driven aimlessly after learning of Liam's tumor. The memories came rushing back. The helplessness, the anger, the overwhelming need to fix what could not be fixed. He had built empires, fought wars in business and love, but nothing had terrified him more than the thought of losing his sons. And now, the nightmare was returning. Bill decided to confront Will directly. When he entered his son's office the next morning, the tension in the air was immediate. Will looked up from his desk, startled but defiant. Bill didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Are you sick?" Will's face went still, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, he tried to maintain his composure, but his father's stare was unrelenting. Finally, the anger cracked. "I don't know," Will whispered. "And I don't want to know." The confession hung between them like smoke. Bill's voice softened, but his tone was firm. "You don't get to hide from this. Not from me." The argument that followed was raw and messy. Will accused his father of treating him like a project, of loving him only when he was strong. Bill countered with fury born of fear. He told Will that he'd rather face the truth and fight it than live with lies. When the shouting subsided, there was only silence and exhaustion. Bill placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his voice trembling. "You're my blood. Whatever this is, we face it together." And for the first time in months, Will allowed himself to cry. Electra arrived later that evening, her face pale with guilt. She had thought she was protecting Will by keeping his secret. Now she realized she had only prolonged his suffering. When she saw him sitting on the couch beside his father, she hesitated at the doorway. But Will looked up, his expression softer than before. "You were right," he said quietly. "I need to know." It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of surrender. The moment a man stops running from the truth. The tests began the next morning. The MRI machine hummed like a cold, mechanical heart, swallowing Will in its metallic mouth. Bill watched from behind the glass, his fists clenched. He had always believed that power could protect those he loved, but in this sterile room, his influence meant nothing. All he could do was wait. When the results came back, the words from the doctor blurred together in Bill's ears. Lesion. Further investigation. possible hereditary link. The only phrase that stayed with him was the same pattern as Liam's. For a moment, time seemed to collapse. Bill felt as though he were falling into the same abyss he had barely climbed out of years ago. But then he looked at Will, who sat quietly, absorbing the news with a kind of grim composure. There was fear in his eyes, yes, but also a strange calm, as if accepting the truth had given him back a measure of control. "I'm not going to die," Will said softly. "Not yet. Not if I can fight." Bill nodded, though his throat burned with emotion. In the weeks that followed, the Spencer family found itself once again caught between science and faith, between despair and defiance. Katie, when she learned the truth, broke down completely. Her maternal instinct turned to panic. She blamed herself, her genetics, her choices. Bill tried to steady her, but he was fraying too. He spent sleepless nights researching treatments, calling specialists, offering blank checks to anyone who could promise a cure. Liam, fragile but stable, visited his brother often, their conversations filled with uneasy laughter and long silences. There was a shared understanding between them now, a bond forged in fear. But the hardest struggle was Will's. The diagnosis stripped away his illusions of strength, forcing him to confront the one truth he had always avoided. Vulnerability was not weakness. He found himself oscillating between hope and despair, between wanting to fight and wanting to disappear. Electra became his anchor during those dark hours. She refused to leave his side, even when he tried to push her away again. There were nights when she simply held him as he trembled, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "We'll get through this," she said. "You're not alone." And though he didn't always believe her, he wanted to. As treatments began, experimental drugs, clinical trials, Will's world shrank to hospital rooms and quiet moments. Yet something unexpected began to change within the family. Bill, once defined by control, learned humility in the face of helplessness. Katie, once paralyzed by fear, found new strength and compassion. Even Liam, whose own illness had once isolated him, became a source of quiet courage for his brother. The Spencers, fractured by years of ego and ambition, found themselves united not by success, but by survival. Still, the tension never fully left them. There were setbacks, scares, moments when the doctor's optimism faltered. Each time, the family teetered on the edge of despair before clawing their way back. Through it all, Electra watched Will transform. The man who had once hidden behind charm and pride began to face his reality with raw honesty. He spoke more softly now, listened more deeply. In a strange way, the illness had stripped him bare, revealing the man he had always been beneath the bravado, a man capable of love without armor, of strength without denial. Months later, as summer bled into fall, the results showed slight improvement. The lesion hadn't grown. It wasn't victory, but it was hope, and that was enough. On a quiet evening, Will sat on the beach outside his father's house, watching the tide roll in. Electra sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. He thought of everything they'd endured, the fear, the lies, the endless waiting, and realized that peace didn't mean the absence of pain. It meant learning to live despite it. Behind them, Bill and Kate